Okay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first panel, the first day. Today we have some excellent papers, which I'm sure you'll all enjoy. The title of the panel is From Paris to Lyon, A Sisterhood Forged in Resistance. And our first presenter today is Paige Delano. And she is a, why do I have the wrong thing here? I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, anyway, I'm sorry. She's an assistant professor in the English department at the Borough of Manhattan College in the CUNY, C-U-N-Y, with her PhD from City University of New York. She's published many articles, including Kay Boyle and Mary Reynolds, A Friendship Intensified by War, and one called Loving Occupiers, Kay Boyle's Critique of Power in Occupied Germany. And also, she's a poet, and she's published poetry including No One with a Past is Safe, which seems like it might be relevant to our subject. Her current project, she's working on American women in Europe during the long World War II, 1938 to 1947, in three parts: American nurses in the Spanish Civil War, American women in France, and fraternization in post-war Germany. So a lot of interesting work, it sounds like. Today's paper is American Women Resistors, An Encounter in Lyon, November 1942. She's going to do the slides.
If you would pull it up. Yeah.
Okay. Good morning. Contrary to some of the early images I show, I'm going to say something slightly different. And so an impressive group of scholars has set out to open the conversation about women in the French Resistance. To name a few: Christine Levesque-Touzé, Dominique Veillon, Annette Reeve-Korka, along with Paula Schwartz, Margaret Rossiter, and Margaret Collins-White. Add to this Sarah Fishman's study of the wives of POWs, which puts repression in tension with desires to oppose German control. The memoirs of Delbo, Aubrac, and Humbert, and Mesnil Esnar Amar, for example, continue in print or have recently reemerged. Could you click? I'm going to just go through some of these. And I'm not going to explain them, although some of them are amazing images. Numerous factors have kept women's stories of resistance in France relatively obscured. A male-oriented perspective, and if you could just go on, that honored men highlighted by the limited number of women, 6, de Gaulle named as companions of the liberation, informs this obscurity. The refusals continue. A refusal to acknowledge that women, too, carried weapons, a dismissal of day-to-day work of hiding, carrying messages, and the like. Women's own desires to return to a normal life and an underestimation of their own importance were coupled with the desire at war's end to continue to keep secret their activities, all of which later made these histories harder to retrieve. So one more. Let's see, one more. Okay, just stop there for a second. This was, in this summer. I would also add an ongoing or revived de Gaullist, French-centric revisionist narrative of a unified France where all resisted and where France liberated itself. One more slide then. These constitute complications in retrieval and research. So now, concerning American women in the resistance, I've been encountering references to their participation in memoirs, letters, historical accounts, women not generally deemed part of the historical record. Although wikis and websites are now starting to pop up with references to some of these women. In Vittel, for example, next slide, for American and British internees, oh, this is my American image, and then the next one, yeah, thanks. American and British internees sought to make contact with, help, or work with the resistance outside of their barbed wire enclosure. This is, of course, not all nuns, and you can see there are a lot of them there. The nuns held on to cigarette rations of their Red Cross packages, aware they were viable commodities that might help the Jewish internees or the outlying resistance. And while I would like to go into more details about Vittel, I'm kind of leaving it here. My attention to American women in the resistance has multiple purposes. One is to recuperate stories largely unknown. Secondly, I seek to expand the conversation, you can go on to a couple more slides, about what it meant to be a resistant. As we come upon more accounts of individual acts of defiance and lowercase, unofficial, spontaneous resistance. And thirdly, I honor the internationalist aspect of the war. And just stop there for a minute. Thirdly, while we surely want to know more about American collaborators, it is important to make more apparent the complex and dramatic ties and shared work between France and its allies, citizen to citizen, in particular actions between those numerous American women who saw themselves as almost French or not really American or only now American. They played roles worthy of note in the resistance, whether or not their activities had measurable impact on the outcome of the war. Thus, my argument in this paper that American women were resistors outside of the OSS structure, at times spontaneously. I'm going to get my water here. They joined together based upon their friendship, cultural networks, and even if they had government ties, their resistance activities were most likely outside of that framework. I could point out the international group which Varian Fry gathered around him, including a number of amazing women, and the great work that Harry Bingham did in spite of the State Department's dictums. But Fry's International Rescue Group was a particular situation. Many others propelled themselves into motion, took risks, endured dramatic escapes. They relied on already established ties and or their own wit, accounts of which often lie far outside official resistance sources. So American women resistors include Virginia Dalbert Lake and Josephine Baker, Virginia Hall of the Wooden Leg, Nadine Oxnard, who received official French attention, but then all of the references seem to have disappeared. Irene Golden Spiegel, nurse from the Spanish Civil War, who married an Austrian. They remained in France. Devereaux Reynolds, who's not related to Mary Reynolds. Etta Schreiber Drew-Tartier and Devereaux Reynolds have all written memoirs of their resistance work. We can include numerous others: Unitarian volunteer Martha Sharp, Betty de Maudit, who was deported to Ravensbrück, Sylvia Beach and Sarah Watson, who when released from Vittel, did their bit to defy the Germans. In a larger work, I aim to bring these women together as American resistance. Here I focus on two women who came together in Lyon in September and November 1942, where their status in France had become even more tenuous, both as Americans and women tied to resistance activities. When the Gestapo caught on to her involvement in the Gloria network in Paris, next slide, please. Okay, next. Okay, this is Mary Reynolds. Mary Reynolds sought a way out of France and landed in Lyon for 2 unexpected months. Constance Ray Harvey, the U.S. consular of the U.S. consular office in Lyon, all that time reaching out to and aiding resistance figures from Belgium, was herself about to be interned by the Germans. She continued to aid those who sought her out. Virginia Hall in Lyon during this period also had contact with Harvey. In a longer paper, I'd include their young French comrade, Violaine Hoppenot, and I think she's the next slide. No, that's Picabia. Hold on to her. Okay. Although Hall had been the subject of extensive discussions and studies, her ties to her American colleagues is the least available, at least as I've found so far. Mary Reynolds wrote her brother, Brooks Hubachek, in the U.S. on December 1st, 1940, when the hardships of occupation had begun for real in Paris, that she was being treated as a poor American. Perhaps I shall become an American citizen at the age of 50, but I don't feel like it yet. This multi-citizen perspective points as well to how other American women saw themselves in France at this time, not simply trying to stay out of harm's way, but unable to, quote, tear themselves away, as Reynolds wrote in that same letter. Reynolds had lived in France since the 1920s, supported by a family income and widow's pension. Her husband had been gassed to death in World War II. World War I. In 1924, she and Marcel Duchamp became romantically engaged, spending much time together in her house in Montparnasse, traveling together, signing letters together to their friends, until he left for the U.S. in early 42. Many biographies of Duchamp get this wrong. They were lovers and essentially lived together for years. She was, next slide, an artist bookbinder, an active participant in the Surrealist movement, and a good friend of Peggy Guggenheim, Kay Boyle, Man Ray, Brancusi, Calder, among many others. In August 41, Reynolds wrote her brother, "My life is devoted to tracking down food and unorganized aid. It is very full." Whether Reynolds anticipates the severity of the war to come or whether she disguises her activities is not clear. We do know she had become part of a network involved in dangerous activities, including retrieving and passing on information about German troop positions and movement. She may have started this work as early as October 1940, when her friend Samuel Beckett got involved through his friend Alfred Perron. She may have had a passive role, hiding documents, next slide, and her friend Jean Helion, this is her house, next slide, an artist friend who had escaped from a POW camp. And the house was used for meetings and hiding documents in its yard. It was dangerous, as she worked with others in the Gloria Network, a unit tied to the British, led by Gabrielle Picabia, a slide I showed earlier, young daughter of the artist Francis Picabia. Reynolds' name is not among those in the Gloria Network, which Picabia lists in a debriefing with the SOE in London in 1944. So I think this is one of those places where information is often contradictory or not there. When Reynolds learned that the Germans were onto her, she fled Paris, as did Beckett and his wife. He was warned, next slide, in August 1942 of the Perron's arrest, quite blatantly there. Reynolds most likely left on September 15th. She managed to gather up 6 Man Ray canvases that he'd left behind among many of his paintings, which is another story. Next slide, please. Janet Flanner documented Reynolds' escape in 3 contiguous articles in The New Yorker in early 1943, although she left out a lot of the specifics, including Reynolds' involvement in the resistance. She called her Mrs. Jeffries, and she noted she had a knapsack as she hiked the Pyrenees from Po into Spain. But first, she went to Lyon. Reynolds crossed the demarcation line in September with the aid of passeurs and ended up in Lyon for nearly 2 months as she awaited travel documents, exit visas, entrance visas, and the like. She felt free, and I cannot explain why. Perhaps in my discussions with colleagues, they can fill me in on this. To send her dear friend, Romanian-born artist Constantine Brancusi, an explicit postcard. The 29th of December, once again with a salutation to Maurice, the name he shared with Duchamp, about her stay in Lyon and that she expected to head to the U.S. Reynolds noted to the OSS when she was applying for a position when she was in New York that she stayed at, next slide, 4 Rue du Bois in Lyon from September 42 to November 42. A corner building not that far from the Saône River. On her application for work with the OSS when she was in New York, she gives Constance Ray Harvey, Department of State, Washington, D.C., as a character reference. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Even without this reference, the ties to Harvey seem to make sense. The rare female career diplomat, Harvey had come from Bern. I'm saying that with a Midwestern accent, which I don't even have. Bern to Lyon's consulate, and according to her 1988 oral history, there's amazing oral histories of women diplomats and other people working in the State Department, et cetera, that many of you may have already known about. She'd worked with the Belgian resistance, which included ties among her staff within the consulate. Harvey was single, independent, and self-reliant. She worked illegally with the U.S. military, Ashe Barnwell Legg, to pass and burn, passing on information which, quote, did not go through Vichy. She noted, I got lots of information from the northern part of France from various quarters and by various people. That went to Leggy as far as we could get it to him, with the pouch going immediately like that, she recalled. She traveled to Switzerland from time to time carrying information. Once I took him a plan of the German anti-aircraft stations in and around Paris. He turned kind of pale and said, I'll remember this. I thought it was pretty good too. She stayed in the same hotel in Lyon as Virginia Hall did, which later became a place where the SS stayed. And of course, there's no reference to any of this in Lyon now. Hall was at that time disguised as a newspaper reporter. And Harvey said of her, in any case, Hall was working for the British, which she was at that time. She did a lot about getting people organized to blow up bridges, and there were a whole lot of things. She had a whole squad of people working for her. Harvey quite literally resisted the Germans when, upon their arrival in Lyon, after the this Allied invasion of North Africa, they forced American diplomats into internment. Harvey wrote of her refusal to board the train until a consular employee who had been arrested and wounded was taken from prison to a hospital. She was successful, and he was later then escaped, and his life was saved. Harvey says, you can never tell who's going to be the hero. They come from the strangest places. So how do I tie this together? How did resistors function? They may have had a careless approach to things. They may have had accidental success and survival. We see this to some extent in the loosely gathered resistance group around the Musée de l'Homme, read now in particular through Agnes Humbert's memoir, Resistance, or Notre Guerre, 1946 is when it first came out. As early as 41, the French police, at the behest of the Germans, had methodically begun to watch and round up resistance members. The police then were able to round up more people because people had address books with their friends' names in them. Indeed, members of the Gloria Network fell into police hands in the months following Reynolds' flight from Paris. It is not clear if American status for a short time protected mostly concealed resistance members who were American. I find numerous women committing themselves to resistance work in spite of potential dangers or naive about the dangers they faced. Both Reynolds and Harvey seem to have stepped into their activities in a seamless way, helping, assisting, using their homes, friendship, or her Reynolds' home, friendship, skills, and diplomatic pouches, even if it was not known or sanctioned by a superior. We may never know if Duchamp and Reynolds disagreed over the extent of involvement. Next slide, I think. Yes. Duchamp himself used a cheese merchant friend's card to be able to pass back and forth across the demarcation line. It was clearly a form of defiance, but was this resistance? He used these treks to get his artwork to Peggy Guggenheim so that they could be shipped to the U.S. As I noted at the start of this paper, the record offers more evidence of escape than it does of activities. Can we simply accept claims if the deeds themselves are not part of the historical record? Likewise, the claims of Drew Tartiere, Devereux Reynolds, or Etta Schreiber, and I found that Charles Glass is using Tartiere in his book, Americans, the book about Americans in France, I thought was slightly sloppy that he just imported her as if it was the truth. I like her, I think she's interesting, but I still see, I'm not even a historian, I'm a literary scholar, but I see some problems with that again. This, of course, is in general a problem of writing history, of the resistance in particular, and the debate over the Aubrac's role in the demise of Moulin stands as an example. But I'm not so agnostic. I think there might be another slide, yeah. Keep going. Okay, this is, yeah, we can leave it there. I'm not so agnostic. And the small pieces of research I have pulled together point to active involvement, whatever the effects may have been. Reynolds landing in New York, having found a way to get Man Ray's canvases to him, and finding a complicated relationship with Duchamp, sought to return to France. The OSS found her a little on the aggressive side. and they didn't give her a job. I think she may have been too French for them as well. That's an interesting issue that I found in other places. She left for New York as soon as she could get a visa. Constance Ray Harvey, released from internment in Baden-Baden, returned to the U.S. and landed in Paris in January 1945. Virginia Hall refitted herself as an old French woman near Normandy and settled in to aid resistance forces in the advent of D-Day. And because there is more official record of her activities in OSS papers, etc., she exists in the historical record, while Harvey and Reynolds, one more, exist in oral histories and fragments, a delight to literary scholars and historians, but of the lower depths. Thank you.